Good morning, everybody, or it might actually be good afternoon. Just a quick reminder that the factual and conceptual questions that we are using to unpack our understanding are screened up here. So we're all about scientific models and why they might be helpful. We're going to overlay that with some content knowledge. And what I want you to do is to pause the video in a moment, and I want you to test yourself on all of these 9 questions. You should be able to recall answers to these fairly easily. If you cannot do that, then I suggest that you go back and have a look at the textbook. Make sure that you perhaps create some flashcards and practice with these, because these are the kind of things that you need now to have at your fingertips and you need to understand. So pause the video now, test yourself, and in a moment we'll move on. So a balanced diet is a question which is on page 2 of the booklet, and it's a diet that has all the different types of nutrients. The classification of the nutrients are lipids, which are also called fats, and oils, carbohydrate, protein, vitamins, and minerals. So the balanced part of this is the fact that every single nutrient is eaten in appropriate quantities depending on the individual. So if you are a pregnant lady, then obviously you need to have more protein in your diet than would ordinarily be the case, because you need the protein to give to the developing fetus within the womb. So this idea of balance and all of the components of the diet you need to know. So in your booklet, check your answer now, pause the video, and add any additions in a different color ink so it really stands out. So when you're reviewing this work, you know that you are focusing on the things that you missed out first time. This is the answers to page 2, question number 2 of page 2 of the booklet too. And again, we need to appreciate here that carbohydrates fall into 3 different categories. We got sugary carbohydrates, we got starchy carbohydrates, and we've got a carbohydrate which is known as dietary fiber. But all 3 of those, A, B, and C, fall under the category of being carbohydrates. So they're classified as carbohydrates. Now, in red, I've put different color codings here. So the micronutrients I've drawn in red and the macronutrients I've drawn in blue. Macronutrients means that they are large molecules, and that means that when you eat them, your digestive system needs to break them down into smaller bits, and those smaller bits can then be absorbed into your blood and then be taken by your blood to your cells to be used. So macromolecules, macro, are large nutrients, whereas micronutrients are small enough to be absorbed straight into the bloodstream. So sugary carbohydrates are used in the body for immediate release of energy. We've got some good sources listed there. Starchy carbohydrates give you more slow release of energy. But in both cases, sugars and starches are ultimately used for the release of energy in a process called respiration by your cells. And again, we've got some examples of good sources of food there. Dietary fiber is vital. It's a macromolecule, it's a large molecule, and the cells of our body cannot make the enzyme to break the dietary fiber down. So it remains a large molecule and it can't be broken down. It passes all the way through your digestive system and it comes out in feces. And dietary fiber is really important in your diet because it bulks out the food and it prevents it getting constipated. And again, there's some examples that are there. So it's important that, again, you check your answers against my answers here, add in corrections in a different color ink. I'm not going to read this out to you because you're perfectly able to read, but you've got the work there for proteins. And if I go on to the next slide here, you can see I've done the same thing with lipids, and I've put lipids there and bolded it up because lipids are macromolecules, which are in the blue color. And then we've got the vitamins and the minerals, and vitamins and minerals are micronutrients. So we've got the balance of all of these which are in our diet, and we mustn't forget that water is very, very important. It's actually not a nutrient per se, but it's an important part of the cell cytoplasm. It's important for blood. It's an important part of your joints. And can you check your answers against these answers here in the booklet? So here you might think I've gone a little bit nuts. I'm feeling a little bit nuts being online all the time, but we've got the periodic table, and the periodic table is a good example of a model. And it's a really good example of a model because it's classifying elements in a very specific way, which allows us to make predictions about the actions of particular elements. Now, you'll do this in chemistry rather than in biology, but I want to draw your attention to a few of the elements which are here. I want you to look at this one, carbon. So carbon is a chemical element that's really, really important in what we're going to think about just now. Next door, we've got this one, N. This is nitrogen. Nitrogen is another important element that we're going to consider. Then we've got oxygen here, included in our list, is very important. And up here, we've got hydrogen. So the periodic table is a good example of a model. And for us specifically, we're interested in the elements hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen. So now we need to think about biological molecules. Biological means that they are found inside living things. Molecules means that you've got more than one atom. So the elements are made up of atoms of the same type. So we've got a molecule which is more than one atom joined together by a chemical bond. And again, this is chemistry really, but chemistry and biology relate very much to one another. So biological molecules are very, very important for life and the life processes Mrs. H. Gren. So the important ones for us to consider, first of all, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And if we move on to this next slide, it's very complicated, but in order to make it a little bit more accessible, the blue stuff is the bits that I'm interested in you appreciating. So carbohydrates, examples are simple sugars like glucose, starch, which is a macromolecule, glycogen, which is a macromolecule, and cellulose, which is also a macromolecule. And all of these are important, and we're going to meet these as we work through the biology syllabus. But all carbohydrates contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And that's the takeaway here. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are what makes up carbohydrates. Now, some carbohydrates are joined together, these particular elements, in a variety of different ways. You can read this for yourself, but we can produce what's called monosaccharides. And a monosaccharide is a single sugar unit, glucose. And glucose has got the chemical formula C6H12O6. And C6 means it's got 6 carbons, H12, 12 hydrogens, O6, 6 oxygens. So a molecule or a monosaccharide of glucose being a good example is made up of the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and it's a molecule because we've got more than one element which is bonded together. Fructose is another example of something called a monosaccharide, but we can take, mono means one. If we take more than one these together, we can add them to make a disaccharide, and a disaccharide is also a molecule, but this time it's double the monosaccharide, sometimes called a dimer, and examples are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. We'll come back to these when we look at work in year 10 on digestion. So all of these examples here are either monosaccharides or disaccharides. They're examples of carbohydrates, okay? And we need to remember also that simple sugars are important in our diet because they give us rapid sources of energy. Another thing that we can add are monosaccharides and disaccharides are very soluble. That means they can dissolve in water. So all of these examples, glucose, fructose, sucrose, lactose, and maltose, they're all soluble and they're part of this overarching classification as being a carbohydrate. But the big takeaway is that they contain the elements carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are models that we draw to show us what a glucose molecule can look like. And a glucose molecule, if you count up the carbons, you'll find that they've got 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. And they can be a straight chain like this, or they can be curled up and form a bond, which is a ring structure. But what we want to look at is representations which will look a little bit more like this. So you'll see this kind of representation in your booklet, but all of these are examples of models. And models are symbolic representations. They allow us to understand what's going on in this case. So what we've got here is a starch molecule. This is a macromolecule. It's also a carbohydrate, remember, and it's made up of these individual bits here, which are sugar bits or saccharide bits, all held together by chemical bonds. When we study digestion, we'll learn that when we eat starch, our digestive system will break the starch down using these things called enzymes, and we break the bonds between these here, and that allows us to produce individual glucose molecules. And these glucose molecules are small enough that they can be taken into our bloodstream at the gut, and they can be taken and transported around to the cells to be used for respiration. So these are a model of glucose. This is a model of a starch, larger carbohydrate molecule, or sometimes referred to as a polysaccharide. So we've got monosaccharides, one, polysaccharides made up of many. Now, this slide is extension material, so please read it, research about it. You might want to push and extend yourself, but this is extra material that you don't really require. This next slide is helpful, I think, because it can show you that we've got various classifications. So we'll start down the bottom here. These are examples of real molecules which are found in living things. They're all examples of what we're going to refer to as monomer, an individual sugar unit, or monosaccharide. If we take two of these and put them together, we produce molecules which are like these. These are disaccharides or dimers, but both of these are the sugary form of carbohydrate. If we've got the non-sugary form of carbohydrate, we have polysaccharides, many sugar units, also called polymers, and there's some examples for us to look at just there. So this is just a little bit of an introduction to carbohydrates, and I'm going to make another video now on lipids and on proteins that you can dip in and have a look at as well.